All right, well, welcome to what I think is our last video lecture for this semester, at least as I recall at the moment. In day 6, we introduced you to the idea of energy systems very briefly. We only spent about 3 or 4 minutes in that video lecture on them. So if it's completely unfamiliar to you, start there first. But if you're remembering some of the content around our energy systems, then let's dive into it more deeply. That's what our focus is going to be for today. When we look at our energy systems, our body uses three primary or three basic energy systems. This particular slide describes the first one as creatine phosphate. That is a component of that first system. I'm going to refer to it more frequently as the immediate energy system. And I'm going to call it that because it acts almost instantaneously. It has the products that it needs or the substrates that it needs stored right within the cell, within the muscle cell already. It doesn't require any oxygen and it doesn't produce any lactic acid. So that's the immediate energy system, of which creatine phosphate is an important component, but we're going to introduce you to ATP a little bit more as well. The second of those systems, this slide labels as anaerobic glycolysis. So anaerobic is something that we've talked about in the past, AN meaning without, and anaerobic meaning oxygen. Glycolysis, we didn't break that into its constituent pieces in your previous lecture, but if we split this here, that suffix of lysis means to split or to cut. So the root word glyco is referring to glycogen, or you will also recognize glucose in there. So we're going to be, without the use of oxygen, we're going to be breaking apart glycogen and breaking apart sugars to create energy. And then the last of the three systems is aerobic. And that's where we're going to see is the most efficient and has the ability to give the most, regenerate the most ATP. But let's make that a little clearer. So we know that we eat to be able to take in calories, and that calories are a representation of the amount of energy within food. So anything that doesn't have calories in it isn't actually producing energy or isn't able to produce energy within your body. That means that the primary essential nutrients that we have, the macronutrients that we consume for energy, are carbs, fats, and proteins. Each of those contains chemical energy stored inside of them, and our body can break them down to release that energy so that our body can use that energy in the ways that it wants. Now, there's three basic stages to that, and we're not going to spend hardly any time on these, but this is something that you should recognize. The first stage of that is you're eating and you're digesting your food, and then from digestion, it needs to be absorbed into the bloodstream and then sent off to the rest of the body. So that's stage one. In stage two, we're going to need to break down those molecules. We'll talk about some of that a little bit today, depending on which system that we're looking at. But there's certainly more complexity into every one of these stages than we're going to be diving into for our intro class. And then the third stage is transferring that energy into a form that all cells can use. Now, if you remember back to that lecture in preparing for day 6, the phrase or the concept of ATP is something that you got introduced to. But let's introduce it to you a little bit more. ATP is a molecule that's stored inside of your cells, and it is what we refer to as the currency for all of your cells, meaning that every single cell utilizes this particular molecule as its primary source of being able to get anything done. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and again, the name is giving some indication. Adenosine is the root molecule here, and attached to it is three, that's what the tri is, phosphates. So there's adenosine triphosphate, means that it has three molecules attached to it. When we talk here in just a moment about adenosine diphosphate, what we're talking about is the body has broken off this one phosphate group, released all the energy in this really high energy bond, and now it's using that energy for what the cell wants rather than having it in this stored form. The phosphate, nothing bad happens to it. It's just broken off of this chain. So that means that if we have more energy, if we can get more energy from another source, we can reattach this free-floating phosphate, if we've already broken it down, back into becoming adenosine triphosphate. So we can go from adenosine triphosphate to breaking off one of the phosphates and releasing energy and having adenosine diphosphate. We can also go the opposite direction. We can have adenosine diphosphate with that other phosphate that's floating around in the cytoplasm. And if we have the energy to be able to do it, we can reconnect them. And that is really the root of metabolism. So when we look at metabolism, the cell is really the processing center. Everything's happening at a cellular level at this point. Within our cell, we can talk about the cell into two primary spaces, either a nucleus or the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm just means it represents the cytosol, all the fluid component, and all the organelles, excluding the nucleus. So the cytoplasm is going to be an important area for us, and we're also going to focus on one of the organelles in particular, and you may already know which one that is. It's referred to as the powerhouse of the cell, but we'll get to it in just a second if you don't know it already. So ATP is referred to as the body's energy currency. Every single cell, every time it needs to do something, it needs ATP to be able to release that energy. It's just the preferred way that your body stores and releases energy for use. So I've already mentioned that we can build ATP, and we build it simply because when we have ADP, where the adenosine triphosphate's been broken down, we have the ADP still within the cytoplasm and the inorganic phosphate within the cytoplasm. We can add those back together. But what do we need? Right, we need to have energy for that. So ATP, we don't store a ton of it inside your cells. We only store about 3 to 5 seconds. We only store enough for about 3 to 5 seconds of maximal effort, or that's just the limits of how much is stored within the individual cells. So anything after 3 to 5 seconds of maximal activity, you have to have another energy source to be replenishing this ATP, or you just have to stop. Your body cannot continue doing any of the activity that it wants to be doing. It's helpful to note that when we're talking about this, this is the other molecule we're talking about as the immediate energy system. So we saw creatine phosphate listed in the last slide. Creatine phosphate and ATP are the two components that make up our immediate energy system. When we break down this high energy bond, it doesn't require any oxygen, and it doesn't produce any lactate. There's no real byproducts to this. But it does give us a chance to rebuild each of those individual things. So there's no lactic acid produced in this. There's no oxygen needed in this. We only have enough ATP for about 3 to 5 seconds of maximal activity within your body. And after that, we just have to make more. We have to be resynthesizing ATP. So we have to utilize another energy source. I think that's all repeat. I think we've gotten through all of that. But this is sort of why you could hold your breath, or this is why you could swim underwater and still do a maximal sprint swim. It's why we can sprint for 3 to 5 seconds while holding your breath. But after that, like, things have to change. We have to move on to other energy systems. So let's take a look at how that progresses. We're still here. We've talked about ATP being stored inside the cell. Now I want to talk about this other component that this slide highlights, which is creatine phosphate. And you'll recognize in here the phosphate sounds really familiar. We talked about it with the triphosphate, adenosine triphosphate, or the diphosphate, ADP, adenosine diphosphate. So this is going to support that ATP to ADP and ADP to ATP system. We're going to move on in a little bit to talking about these other two, which language is a little more familiar to you by now, I hope. So let's talk about phosphocreatine. Here we're talking about, you can see in this slide, they've listed it as the ATP-CP. So that's our immediate energy system. It's utilizing both adenosine triphosphate and creatine phosphate. And you can see that it's going to be, when we do maximal activity, it's going to be the most important energy system right out of the gate, right at the very beginning. But it also fatigues, it gets tired, it runs out of energy really, really quickly. So we have to have these other energy systems that are also going to support our performance and our activity. You can see one listed as glycolytic. I'll explain what that means in a moment. And we have one listed as oxidative, which you recognize the root of that as it's using oxygen. So that's our aerobic system. And I bet you can figure out this glycolytic from there. But in focusing on the immediate energy system, we've talked about ATP, creatine phosphate, or phosphocreatine. It can be labeled either way, is essentially just an amino acid, creatine, bound to a phosphate group, and there's a high energy bond in here as well. So we can break that apart. We can have this phosphate that's floating around, and now we can take this extra energy and we can take it and use it to take the ADP, might be a little hard to see here, but you can take the ADP and that phosphate and reform ATP. Because remember, we said that everything that the cell does, it wants to use ATP for that stored energy. That's where it's going to get stuff from. So every system we talk about from now on is trying to take ADP and the inorganic phosphate and trying to create the energy so we can put those things back together just so your body can break them apart. So it just keeps cycling and cycling and cycling. And this immediate energy system is doing that. Creatine phosphate is doing part of that. You may have heard of creatine phosphate or phosphocreatine. Its most common consumable format is called creatine monohydrate. So again, anaerobic, meaning it didn't take any oxygen to do this. It's going to reform ATP by releasing that energy in the high energy bond between creatine and phosphate, and then you're going to use that energy to take ADP and phosphorylate means put the um, to put that molecule back on and reform ATP. So it also turns out that we can remember that phosphate group was just floating around once we broke it off of creatine. If at a later date from another space we can come up with enough energy to put those back together, creatine and that phosphate can be put back together as well. So we can reform ATP and we can reform CP. And something nice about phosphocreatine is your cell actually stores a lot more of it than it stores ATP. So somewhere between 4 and 6 times more phosphocreatine than ATP. And that's one of the reasons that some athletes choose to take this supplement in hopes that it's going to improve their performance. Okay, so here's a little bit of an illustration of that. Let's talk about it again. Adenosine triphosphate can be broken down into adenosine diphosphate. The phosphate's still around, it's just not attached anymore, but now we've got the release of energy because we broke the pieces apart. We can also go backwards if we have adenosine diphosphate with that phosphate that's floating around. If we add in energy, we can reform ATP. And over again, this is the focus of what metabolism is all about, trying to create enough energy for this pathway from ADP plus the inorganic phosphate to create ATP, just so your body can break it down again. And then here's the same pathway for phosphocreatine. Same thing, it's a bidirectional arrow. So we can take phosphocreatine and break it down to release energy. If we have energy, we can also use that energy to recombine them to create phosphocreatine. Okay, so let's move on. That was your immediate energy system. That was the very first one. It allows for maximal activity for typically a max of around 10 seconds or so, depend on how much phosphocreatine you actually have stored inside of your cells. Doesn't require any oxygen, doesn't create any lactic acid, but it also is a really brief activity. We want to do things that extend beyond just 10 seconds in activity length. So how are we going to get the energy to continue to resynthesize ATP or to make more ATP over and over again? Well, we've already talked about our macronutrients, our proteins, our carbs, and our fats. This illustration shows in a very general sense how proteins, carbs, and fats can be broken down into their smaller and smaller pieces and then enter into different areas of metabolism. So this largest blue circle here, or oval here, is trying to represent one cell. Then within that one cell, is one mitochondria blown up really large just for emphasis. And that is a mitochondria. So we're looking at one cell is the outer boundary, and the cytoplasm is all the stuff inside. And this is showing one single representative mitochondria within that cell. So what you can see here then is we're going to focus on sugars first. We're going to focus on carbs first. We know that our carbs are made up of sugars, so we can break those down through digestion and absorption into simple sugars. Those can travel through the bloodstream and be delivered down to the individual cells. The type of sugar your body likes best is called glucose. That's why you see it listed here. And you've heard about glycolysis. We use that name already, or the anaerobic glycolytic pathway. All of those, you can hear the glucose portions in there. You're seeing this process called glycolysis listed right here. So it's showing that glucose is coming in. It goes through this process of glycolysis, and you can see that we've formed this ATP. We also have formed these hydrogen ions. You can see the H that's listed there. And then from there, this is taking place in the cytosol. You can see that byproduct, or that not waste product, but the end product can continue on further into the mitochondria, and we're going to talk about those stages. But let's come back to this for right now. So remember, we're looking to produce more ATP, but we've used up the constituent pieces within the immediate energy system. So the next fastest one for us to be able to break down is glycogen. Glycogen just means that you have multiple glucose. That's the sugar that your body loves the most. It converts just about every sugar that you eat, every carb that you eat is broken down and repurposed and remade into glucose. Then we can add glucose together, stack them together, and that's what we refer to as glycogen. So glycogen is glucose, it's just big chains of it. Now, glycogen we actually store right within the muscle cell. So we have some within the muscle cell if we're active and trained that way. And we also store significantly more in the liver. So the liver, if it thinks that there is a need within the body, it can break down that glycogen, send it into the bloodstream, and then the blood can carry it off to any tissue that's going to need it. So let's talk about this new system. If we're going to start to break down carbohydrates now, we're going to start to break down glycogen. Glycogen enters into an anaerobic system, and we know what that means. It means without oxygen. From that anaerobic system, there is going to be some energy released. This process is taking place in the cytosol, remember. This is taking place in the cellular fluid. So glycogen can be broken down. It's broken down without the need for oxygen. So that means as soon as we have glycogen just split apart, we can start tearing it apart also. It's not as fast as the immediate energy system, but if we already have that glycogen stored inside the cell, it's really, really quick. And it's releasing energy. So that's what we wanted. We were releasing that energy to reform ATP so that we could just go through the whole process again. But you'll also see that following glycolysis, this process together would be referred to as glycolysis. Remember, lysis meant the breaking down or splitting apart. So we're splitting apart glucose. The end product of that, besides the energy, which was so important, is this product called, or this molecule called pyruvate. Now, pyruvate turns out to be really, really important because what pyruvate can do is, in the absence of enough oxygen, when we're starting to produce more and more hydrogen that our body doesn't want to be just free floating, that hydrogen can bind to pyruvate, and that's when you get what you refer to, what we know as lactic acid. So pyruvate bound to hydrogens creates lactate or lactic acid. And the great benefit of this is now I can get that into the bloodstream and away from that individual cell. So that individual cell can continue to keep working at its maximal as long as it has an energy source because it's not becoming acidic inside of the cell. So lactic acid is not really a bad thing. It's actually protecting you to be able to allow you to continue at a high intensity for a longer duration. It takes that hydrogens that are being produced as part of this glycolysis system, and it moves them to another part of the body to be broken down or to be synthesized, essentially. If we do have enough oxygen, then that pyruvate, instead of binding to hydrogen and following our pathway that goes this way, and you can see these are all bidirectional. So once pyruvate is turned into lactate by binding to those hydrogen, it could go the other way. We could release those hydrogen in another cell, form it into pyruvate, and there's all of these are bidirectional. So that's important for me to notice. The ones that aren't bidirectional are helpful for you to recognize. So if pyruvate, if there is enough oxygen in the cell, pyruvate will move down into the aerobic energy system, which we're going to see actually takes place in the mitochondria. It's going to need oxygen to work in that aerobic energy system, but that pyruvate can be broken down, release a lot of energy, and then the waste products or the byproducts of the aerobic energy system are only water and carbon dioxide. So one of which you can sweat out or urinate out, the other of which you breathe out. You'll also notice that our other macronutrients can feed into this aerobic energy system. So we got a good overview going on. Let's look at the biggest picture again here. We just started talking about how do carbohydrates get broken down to be able to help us reproduce, resynthesize ATP if the immediate energy system is depleted. So carbs get broken down into their individual sugars, into the simple sugars. Those simple sugars are almost all converted to glucose because that's our body's favorite form of sugar. Glucose can get stacked together, glucose molecules all combined together to form glycogen. That's where that name comes from. When we break down one single sugar molecule, one single glucose molecule, we call that process glycolysis. It's taking place inside of the cytoplasm, inside the cytosol, the fluid portion of the cell. That process does not require any oxygen, but it does produce energy, and it does produce these hydrogens, which we have to do something with, and you're going to see they're really valuable or important later on. You're going to actually see them highlighted down here in the mitochondria. So we are producing hydrogens. If we have no place to put those hydrogens, we're going to bind them to pyruvate. It's going to form lactic acid, and then your body's going to say, let's get it out of this cell so this cell doesn't become too acidic. If there is enough oxygen, then that pyruvate is going to go through the next stages of aerobic metabolism. And you can see here some things that might sound familiar to you. The first of that aerobic metabolism. Now notice we're in the mitochondria. I'm drawing out that illustration here, or I'm tracing out the oval, the light blue oval that represents the mitochondria. That pyruvate has gone from the cellular fluid into the mitochondria. It now enters into the citric acid cycle, which has all kinds of names. You may know it as the Krebs cycle. Chemists like to talk about it as the tricarboxylic acid cycle. It has lots of names, but Krebs cycle and citric acid cycle are probably the two you're going to encounter the most in kinesiology. So from there, it's going to go down into another system that we're going to talk about. So inside of here, we're talking about aerobic metabolism. So let's take a look at that aerobic metabolism component now. The aerobic metabolism takes place once pyruvate leaves from the cytosol and enters into the mitochondria and begins going through this breakdown that we refer to as the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. Now, this is aerobic metabolism, so we can actually create that component that's going to go through the Krebs cycle, not just from sugar, which is where we've started our conversation, but we can actually take parts of fats and we break them down in a process that we refer to as beta oxidation. And some of our amino acids from our proteins, some of the amino acids from the proteins we can break down as well. So as we go into this aerobic system, you can see that any of the three macronutrients could be supporting this level of energy production. Carbs was essentially the only thing that could really meaningfully support the anaerobic system. Now we're going to see that all of these different macronutrients can help in this system. Once we've gone through the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, the last stage within aerobic metabolism is what we refer to as the electron transport system. Now, this slide can look a little bit complicated. What this, but I'm gonna try to make it really understandable for you. What you're seeing here is an amazing way that God created your body within the electron transport system. So this is a stage of releasing energy that's taking place within the mitochondria of every single cell in your body. And it's doing this using carbs, fats, and proteins to be able to release this energy. We start off with this higher energy molecules, which I don't think I want to explain a bunch of right now, but you'll recognize this NADH had come one of its sources had come from glycolysis. We talked about hydrogen as being an important product from those things. So let's say we're just starting with this higher energy molecules. And they're going and being passed in bucket brigade fashion from one cytochrome to another. So you're handing this high energy molecule off over and over and over again. And what happens is, if you think of it like a water wheel, there's lots of potential energy at the beginning. It passes or hands off to one cytochrome, continues on down to another, and continues on down to another. And if we think of those as water wheels, we're generating or we're taking some of that potential energy and transferring it in. Now that we've released that extra energy, we're reforming ATP. Remember, we said all of these things that we're talking about, we're working to reform ATP from the adenosine diphosphate and the inorganic phosphate that we broke it into. But look, we're having that happen over and over and over and over again. That's why this is becoming super helpful. You'll also see at the bottom here, what is it that we have to have down here at the very bottom to hand that hydrogen off to? We have to have oxygen. So this is why we refer to this as the aerobic pathway. So located in the mitochondria, these things called cytochromes that are embedded within the mitochondria take in these hydrogen ions that we've developed or that we've created as we've broken down sugars and fats and proteins. And now we're going to, like a water wheel, keep getting energy out of those, keep getting energy out of those, keep getting energy out of those, and using that energy to remake ATP. And at the very end, when there's just about no energy left, we attach those hydrogens to some oxygen, and there's our waste product of water. Okay, so we've talked about all three of the different energy systems. This one's going to use some of the same language. Not every slide uses all identical language. So at the beginning, we talked about lasting for somewhere around 10 seconds was the immediate energy system. This slide referred to it as anaerobic because it wasn't going to be needing any oxygen, and they refer to it as alactic. There's that A meaning not the absence of, so it doesn't produce any lactic acid. This is our immediate energy system, which was comprised of two major molecules. Remember what they are? ATP and creatine phosphate. After that 10 seconds, those two energy sources are depleted. They are used up. And we have to find energy from other sources to resynthesize ATP. So the next in line was the anaerobic system. This was glycolysis, is the way that I typically refer to it, but this slide is talking about it as the anaerobic without oxygen. Lactic, it is going to produce lactic acid energy system. Now that's going to be lasting us for about a minute of maximal activity. You can't sprint at your highest speed and maintain that speed and that intensity for more than about a minute. Training can push this one direction, can push this a little bit further for some of us, but a minute's a really good boundary to think about. So, immediate energy system, anaerobic energy system, and then the last is the aerobic energy system. And you can see here as we extend out that activity that not only is the intensity going to change, the speed at which we run 800 is going to be different from the speed at which we run a marathon, but we're going to rely on these systems at different rates based off of our energy needs. So I like that slide. There's a few slides that I like a little bit better, but first I just want to remind you we're really talking about breaking down all three of these macronutrients. So we can be breaking down sugars. What are we looking at here? We can be breaking down fats. We can be breaking down our ATP or our creatine phosphate for our immediate energy system. And if needed, our body can break down proteins, but it's really not what we would prefer to do. We'd rather break down sugars or fats. They get delivered on down to the individual cell. Once they're in the cell, they get into the cell and transfer themselves into the mitochondria. And when they're in the mitochondria, then they can go through the citric acid cycle, which was the first step of aerobic metabolism, and then the electron transport chain, which was the second phase of aerobic metabolism. And in the end, all three of these, whether it's an amino acid, whether it's a sugar, or whether it's a fatty acid, can turn into a whole bunch. Now, we saw this illustration a little bit before, but I just want to show you, and I want to remind you that it's really easy, and it's the way that the textbook, any textbook you read is going to talk about it, and it's the way that we're going to talk about it in lecture. We talk about one system at a time. Here's the immediate energy system, here's the anaerobic energy system, and in green, here's the aerobic energy system. And we discuss and define each of them separate and individually, just for the ease of clarification. But you'll notice from the very beginning of activity, every one, all three of these energy systems are being used all the time. It's just that depending on the duration and the intensity that you're working at, one energy system might be really dominant at different stages of an event or an activity. So we are always using all three to make and resynthesize ATP, but different ones become dominant at different times. And that's where I think these slides do a lot better job. So over on this left-hand side where you're seeing the more purplish blue, this is the anaerobic side. These are examples of activities that are going to use either the immediate energy system, the ATP-CP, or they're going to be using the anaerobic system where they're going to produce lactate. So 100-meter dash, ice hockey, good examples of like you're doing lots of sprints, right? When you're doing lots of sprints, those are the types of anaerobic sort of pieces. As we move more and more towards this other side, which is using the aerobic system or the oxygenated system, you can see that even something like a 2-mile run is not fully the aerobic system. It still has some component of the ATP and lactic acid system. A 200-meter swim has a lot more of the lactic acid system than it does the oxygen system. Soccer with more sprints on the ball and less just running the field is going to rely more towards the lactic acid system than the oxygen system. But I like this slide because it gives a variety of different examples showing how there's this moderation where all of these systems are constantly being used. I think this one might be even more insightful just because it's using the exact same kind of activity over and over again. So you'll notice in this graph, what they're showing is the immediate energy system represented by the yellow color, the lactic acid or the anaerobic system, glycolysis being represented by the blue, and then the orange representing the oxygenated system. So in a 100-meter dash, we're using mostly the immediate energy system and a mix of the lactic acid energy system, but there's nothing really in that short of a sprint at that high of an intensity. There's nothing really that we're working from the aerobic side. In a 400-meter race, you know that you can't just flat out sprint that at full maximal speed for the entire 400. So we have to pace ourselves to some extent, and that means that we're also including some of the aerobic system, but it's not really dominant. We're still really pushing ourselves to go at the highest pace that we can. In the 800-meter, you need to pace yourself more, so we're going to see a greater contribution of the aerobic energy system. And in a marathon, this can be hours in duration. You're definitely pacing yourself more, and you're going to see this break in here just shows us that it's not meant to show a continuous. Like this could be significantly longer. piece that the aerobic is contributing. So we've talked about the three energy systems. We've talked about how macronutrients feed into those. You should be able to make connections to our cardiovascular system, not only to the pulmonary system and its need to supply oxygen, but also the vascular system's ability to deliver things through the bloodstream. And those things can be both the oxygen and the nutrients and the waste products. And that's where I want to leave you for today. I hope you have a great day, and I will talk to you another time. See you later.